Chapter 14. Now that we had the songs and the beginnings of a look and feel, we needed a band. We weren't Simon and Garfunkel, we weren't the Everly Brothers, we weren't Jan and Dean. Our songs were built to rock. We made finding a lead guitar player our initial priority. I had never aspired to play lead. To be honest, I wasn't sure I was capable of it. When I listened to people sing, I knew I could do something reasonably comparable. But I rarely heard a guitar solo and thought, I can do something like that. Unless somebody was playing slowly, once in a while I heard a solo by Paul Kossoff of Free and thought I might be able to pull it off, but I just wasn't a fast, flashy player. My gut also told me that this was an area where work might not pay off for me, that I might get only mediocre results regardless of how much time I put into it. Fortunately, Gene knew the perfect guy for the job. Unfortunately, the perfect guy for the job lived upstate, and Gene didn't know exactly where, or even exactly who he was. He had run across somebody when he lived up there, and this person, whoever it was, became our first target. So that fall of 1972, we started hitchhiking up to the Catskills in search of the mythical lead guitar player who apparently played in the bars and ballrooms of the low-rent resort circuit up there. We stood on the side of the major Deegan Expressway with our thumbs out, me in lime green high-heeled boots and him in an antique woman's fur coat. Inevitably, we hit the road without a place to stay. One night, we met some people from a commune outside one of the towns, and they invited us to stay at their place. It turned out to be a barn, and we slept in the chicken coop. The people we'd met collected the eggs. That was their role in the commune. They offered us warm food, but the place was such a wreck that I was reluctant to eat. Later, in the middle of the night, I woke up famished. I went into the kitchen to see if anything was left in the oven. When I opened it, a mouse scampered out. Another time, two girls in a VW van pulled over and took us up to spend the night at their place at the top of a mountain. It must have taken us 10 minutes just to get up the winding driveway. Their house was either not yet finished or derelict, and they offered us some spots on the subflooring alongside their dogs. As we were lying on the floor half asleep, one of the girls walked through the room stark naked. Gene opened his eyes and I watched them follow her. I already knew that Gene tried to screw everybody and anybody. It was part of how he defined himself, possessed by and obsessed with pussy. If you make a move on her and she's insulted, I whispered pleadingly, they're going to throw us out of here in the middle of nowhere. We'll end up freezing to death at the top of this fucking mountain. He held back, but the next morning he wound up trying it on with her, successfully. It turned out she wore a hearing aid, he told me, and whenever he leaned in close to her, he heard feedback. Another weekend, we ended up in a town that had already rolled up and gone to bed. We stood on a desolate street until finally a car came towards us. We put out our thumbs and the car pulled over. Inside were four tough-looking black guys. Where are you going? The driver asked. Oh, us? We're not going anywhere. The driver got mad. You had your thumbs out. Where are you going? We told him we were trying to get to Grossinger's, a big Borscht Belt resort. Gene knew somebody there we could crash with. Get in. It sounded more like a command than a welcome. The next thing I knew, we were winding down an unlit dirt road and I was starting to get scared. Then I saw another car pulled off to the side of the road up ahead. Great, they're waiting for us. Two Jews served up on a stick. We pulled up, and another group of tough-looking guys got out of the car. My life flashed before my eyes, but it turned out they just wanted to hang out and drink. When we got back in the car, we said, you know, you don't have to take us. With a combination of anger and threatening annoyance, the driver hissed, I said I'd take you. And he did, all the way to Grossinger's. We never tracked down that guitar player, but those trips were an affirmation of our commitment. Who else but Gene would have taken those trips, thumbing rides the way we were dressed, having no place to stay, sleeping on floors, barely having any money in our pockets? Most people would have just put an ad in the newspaper, which is what we did next, or rather we looked at the ads. Only instead of looking for a lead guitar player, we decided to seek out a drummer. Eventually, we found an interesting ad in Rolling Stone and rang the number. We had one line of questioning. Would you do anything to make it? Yeah, said the guy on the other end of the line. Would you wear a dress? Yeah. We arranged to meet the guy in front of Electric Lady down on 8th Street. He was dressed very cool, cooler than us. He looked quite a bit older than I was, and he had about 5 names. George, Peter, John, Criscola, blah, 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 but he went by Peter Chris. We walked to a pizza joint and sat down with our slices. We hadn't been talking for 5 minutes when Peter blurted out, "I have a 9-inch dick." I didn't know what to say. Pass the cheese? This guy was very different from us. Peter could barely read or spell, and he wasn't a thinker. Still, we agreed to go see him play a gig he had coming up in a bar in Brooklyn. The place was called the King's Lounge, and the other 2 guys in his band looked like they should be making pizzas or cement shoes. Peter looked completely different from them, and he exuded an air of confidence. He had swagger. The crowd was sparse, but something about his performance struck me. He played the bar like it was a packed arena. He was into it. After that, we asked him to come to our rehearsal space the next day to try playing together. When he played with us the first time at 23rd Street, it didn't sound particularly good. Peter didn't know much about British music. He knew the Beatles, and he liked Charlie Watts of the Stones. But that was probably because he liked to believe he played like Charlie Watts, basic, not showy. As for any other drummers, the ones he couldn't play like, he disliked them all. Peter also didn't understand the basics of song structure, verse, chorus, bridge. It all meant nothing to him. If I said, "Let's pick up at the 2nd verse," he just sat there. He had to memorize a song from beginning to end, and if we stopped in the middle or he lost his place, he was fucked. Perhaps as a result, his playing was wild. You could call it unorthodox, but that wouldn't be accurate. It was just plain erratic. His drum parts would change verse to verse. Still, for all he lacked in continuity, he played with fire and vitality. He was scrappy. We asked him back for another rehearsal. The next rehearsal went much better. Again, his playing showed personality and a real zest for life. Some of the songs developed a different feel than Gene and I originally might have had in mind. Peter just couldn't play like the drummers we had in our heads as we wrote, but what he delivered still worked as a blueprint for the band we wanted to be. Looking back now, there's no denying that a drummer like John Bonham wouldn't have fit what we were doing, although if we had our druthers, Gene and I would certainly have gone in that direction. Back then, Peter was the right guy for the band. His drumming was brash and full of piss and vinegar. Peter instinctively played ahead. At times we had to catch up to him. In the best-case scenario, a drummer is like the back of a chair. You can lean back on it and know it's there for you. It's a foundation. But Peter ran alongside us, which was a different animal altogether. Even so, things just clicked. Even as a trio, we sounded very promising. So promising, in fact, that we decided to once again play for Epic Records to see whether or not they wanted to keep us under our existing contract. By this point, Gene and I had scraped together the money to buy new gear. I'd bought 2 guitars, a Tobacco Sunburst Gibson Firebird, and a guitar I had custom-made by a guy named Charlie LeBeau. I got to know Charlie when he worked at a little second-floor shop on 48th Street. It was the first shop I'd ever seen that specialized in vintage guitars. Dan Armstrong stocked Sunburst Les Pauls from the 1950s, beautiful instruments that were always out of my reach financially. But Charlie, who specialized in repairing the instruments, had struck out on his own and started building guitars. I bought a walnut-colored double cutaway from him. The Gibson Firebird started off as a standard. I liked it because it reminded me of one Eric Clapton had played in Cream. I sent it to work with my dad one day and asked him to have the guys at the furniture shop paint it black. It didn't end up with the finish you might normally get on a piano or guitar, but it was black. We had also bought a PV sound system with 2 big speakers on telescoping stands and a mixing board with huge Frankenstein dials. We needed it for the vocals. In our rehearsal space, in any small clubs we figured we might soon play, we didn't need to mic our guitar amps. They were loud enough on their own. Don Ellis, who was head of Epic at the time, and some other execs came down to 10 East 23rd to see the band in late November 1972. We referred to ourselves as the new version of Wicked Lester. Of course, we knew this was a completely new entity, but we didn't have a name yet. We played our new repertoire, which was basically the songs that made up Kiss's debut album. During Firehouse, I took a fire bucket full of confetti and threw it over Ellis, who cringed thinking the bucket was full of water. In the end, Epic wanted nothing to do with the band. They passed and waived any legal obligations that still might have been lingering from the Wicked Lester contract. I had never envisioned the band as a power trio anyway. I never wanted to try to sustain the band on my guitar alone. Jimi Hendrix could do it. Pete Townsend could do it. Jimmy Page could do it. I could not. And besides, I wanted to swing my arm and pose and leave the acrobatic playing to somebody else. So it was back to the drawing board, or rather back to the newspaper. We really needed a lead guitar player. Chapter 15. Guitar player wanted with flash and balls. That was the ad we placed in the Village Voice. And when we opened the door to our rehearsal space on the appointed day in December 1972, we had a lot of takers, more than 30. But becoming a rock star meant looking like a rock star, so we had some specific rules: no bald heads, no beards, and no excess weight. One guy came in a Nehru jacket and beads around his neck. He couldn't speak a word of English. His wife accompanied him as an interpreter. He's from Italy, she explained. Another guy named Bob Kulick was a really good player, but he didn't fit the look we had in mind. After a long and mostly fruitless freak show, a guy walked in wearing one red sneaker and one orange sneaker. He was about my age and kind of goofy and pigeon-toed. While we were still talking to Bob, this other guy plugged in his guitar and started playing. "Hey man, shut up and wait your turn," we told him. Eventually, we plugged in with him, and almost from the minute we started playing, something happened that took us to a completely different place. The combination of the four of us was so much bigger than anything we'd done with the other guitar players. We weren't the greatest musicians, but the chemical reaction of the four of us was potent. 1 minute we had been one thing, and a minute later, with this guy named Ace Frehley, we became something else, something undeniable. I was absolutely stunned. This is it. This is lethal. This is the goods. Ace had swagger, that's for sure. His playing reminded me of guys I really liked: Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck. He was also a total oddball. He moved in a rubbery way and barely spoke. He shrugged his shoulders a lot. We all knew very quickly that this was it. Around Christmas, after our second rehearsal with Ace, we called the guy who had managed Wicked Lester, Lou Lynette, to gauge his interest. He was a nice guy, but pretty clueless about rock and roll. He managed a band called J.F. Murphy and Salt that played at the Fillmore East sometimes, as well as an old folkie named Oscar Brand. Lou was more of a beatnik than a rocker, but he agreed to come to the rehearsal space to see the group we had dubbed Kiss. Thankfully, all the band members had voted in agreement with the name when I came up with it. I had been prepared to fight for it because I was so sure the next key to moving forward was coming up with a band name that was classic and timeless. I saw the name as having multiple meanings. There was the kiss of death in addition to kisses of passion. It was easily recognizable. And it was so familiar that I thought people might say, "Kiss? Oh yeah, I've heard of them." When Lou showed up and we launched into our set, he immediately got upset. "If you don't turn down the volume, I'm going to walk out of this room," he shouted angrily. When we told him about our desire to wear makeup, he whined in exasperation, "Why can't you dress like the Raspberries?" The Raspberries wore matching white suits. Clearly, Lou didn't understand our aim. Oh well, we could book gigs ourselves, and besides, we still had plenty to work on. We wanted to be a power band with roots in British rock and roll, but we wanted to take it 10 steps further. We still didn't know just how that would manifest itself. I had sketch pads full of other ideas. I'd been trying to envision the band I would want to see as a fan, and in addition to stacks and stacks of amps, that vision included distinct characters like the Four Beatles and signature looks cribbed from movies like Zorro and The Lone Ranger and from superhero comic books. For now, though, we stuck with the trend of the New York Dolls and all the other local bands and looked glam and feminine with platform boots and rouge, lipstick, and heavy eyeshadow. Once we had solidified the foursome, we rehearsed 7 days a week. While other bands made names for themselves by playing the Mercer Arts Center or hanging out at Max's Kansas City, we ensconced ourselves in our loft on 23rd Street rehearsing. All those bands were far cooler than we were as people, far more socially adept, and they looked the part more than we did, but nobody worked harder than we did. Sometimes when I was driving the taxi, I would even leave my car at the taxi stand on 23rd Street and 5th Avenue and go up to the loft to practice. Working with Ace came very organically. We didn't have to coach him the way we had to coach Peter. Ace just fit. And after practicing with him for about a month, we were ready to make our live debut. We booked ourselves 3 consecutive nights at a place on Queens Boulevard that had just changed its name from Popcorn to Coventry. A lot of the hip New York City bands soon ended up playing out at Coventry too, including the Dolls, the Brats, the Dictators, Television, and Sniper, which was Joey Ramone's first band. The first of the 3 gigs was on January 30th, 1973. On the morning of the show, I took the subway to Long Island City, the industrial part of Queens right along the East River. There, I rented a van at Public Service Rentals. It was the cheapest place to get trucks. Then I drove into 23rd Street, where later in the day we loaded our gear from the rehearsal space. Ace turned up late and refused to carry anything, not one thing. When we arrived at the club and parked out back, Ace did the same thing. He sat in the back of the van and didn't carry anything. Then as we were unloading it, Ace pulled out his penis totally out of the blue and said, "This is my dick without a hard-on." Huh? I didn't know what was up with Ace and Peter and their dick-size obsessions. Though as time went on, I began to suspect that this was the way they defined themselves and what was important to them. Fewer than 10 people showed up for our first gig. The place probably held 500. We still tried to blow the roof off the place. We knew we'd always remember the show, and it felt great. I'll want to remember this. We played the next 2 nights at Coventry, and each night the crowd was sparse. After each show, we drove back to 23rd Street to stow the gear. Ace sat on his ass and boozed. We were still getting used to his personality. The shows confirmed that he was everything we were looking for musically. But they also confirmed the fact that he was one of the laziest people, no, the laziest person I had ever met. These first shows made some things clear to me. I had always wanted a big sound, a 2-guitar steamroller, like Humble Pie, and we had achieved elements of that, but at the same time we lacked a sense of heft, of magnitude. I almost felt as if the other guys had jeopardized the band. They acted small time. Ace had babbled into the mic during one of the shows. Peter had said, "I want to thank my friends from Canarsie for coming out tonight." That did not sound big league. It detracted from the image I wanted to project. Perception was reality. I realized there were 3 guys on that stage in Queens who were clueless about how to relate to an audience. You want to be small time? Give a shout out to Tony and Guido. You want to be huge? Make the right impression no matter how many people are there. Interact with the audience as if you're all at Madison Square Garden. From that point on, I was adamant that I would be the one leading the charge on stage. I would be the spokesman. Everybody chattering away was just too chaotic. And even though I had never done it, I knew I could. I knew it. I already had the blueprint. The reason I loved Humble Pie was Steve Marriott, the lead singer, who always seemed to be leading a church revival. He never spoke. When he communicated with the audience, he testified and sang, bringing everything to a fever pitch. Say hallelujah. That was exactly what I was going to do. Say hallelujah, people. I wanted Kiss to be church. That's right. Rock and roll church. Can I get an amen? Funny thought for a Jew. Funny thought, too, for a guy who was in many ways still painfully shy, but I was absolutely confident I could create somebody on stage who would be riveting and engage the audience. That's probably why I had an odd accent early on, vaguely British, vaguely Southern preacher. It was a way to pass myself off as something a bit more exotic than a kid from Queens. The on-stage character camouflaged the ill-suited kid with an ear deformity from a dysfunctional family. I would be flamboyant and cocksure. I would project the image that I was coveted and desirable. I would be the guy everyone wanted to know. All the people I perceived as having not been nice to me, as having rejected me as a friend, they would be sorry. But in truth, I would be the Wizard of Oz, the awkward little man behind the curtain operating this huge persona. Chapter 16. The New York Dolls were the template for most bands coming out of the city at the time. Of course, I'd heard of them, but up until then, I hadn't seen them live. One night in March 1973, Gene and I went to see them at a ballroom in a sleazy midtown hotel called the Diplomat, the kind of hotel where hookers and junkies crashed. They were the kings of the New York City rock scene and arrived fashionably late, actually intolerably late. They looked spectacular, and when they took the stage, the camaraderie and chemistry were amazing. Their playing, however, was not. Still, they looked terrific. Their waists were as big as my wrists. Jean and I looked like linebackers by comparison. We looked at each other. We realized Kiss looked more like a bunch of firemen in drag or something. This wasn't going to work. We couldn't beat the dolls at their own game. Forget being a better dolls. We had to be a better Kiss. We had to win on our own terms. After that show, we decided to ditch all our colorful clothing and remake ourselves in a sinister, all-black look. I used to window shop at a couple of boutiques where they stocked all the latest rock and roll fashions, particularly the stuff that was hot in London. One day, I saw a pair of pants in Jumpin' Jack Flash that would be perfect for our new look, but they cost $35. That was a lot of money. I decided I could buy fabric and make something similar myself. I had never used a sewing machine before, but I took apart my favorite pair of bell-bottom jeans and made a pattern. My mom kept saying I wouldn't be able to put in the zipper. I can do anything. It's simply a question of working at it. The pants in sleek metallic black satin came out great and cost next to nothing, and the zipper worked fine. Gene liked them so much that he asked me to make a pair for him too, which I did. Ace's mom made him a shirt with an applique of an eagle on it. Then we went to a pet store and bought dog collars for ourselves. I needed a Great Dane collar. The poodle collar didn't fit. Eventually, we worked our way to shops that sold S&M gear. I'll never forget climbing the stairs to a place in the meatpacking district and walking in absolutely wide-eyed. I had no idea what I was looking at. Leather hoods with zippered eyes and a tube in the mouth? What on earth did you do with that? We ended up finding some of our early studded cuffs and collars at another S&M place, the Eagle's Nest, down in the West Village. Somehow, wearing white face paint went hand in hand with our new outfits. Together in our loft on 23rd Street, we all sat around looking at a mirror on the back of the door. We had no idea how to apply makeup. It was as if we were possessed, just smearing makeup on, wiping it off, trying different things. First I tried out red makeup, then I tried a ring around my eye like Petey the dog in The Little Rascals. But stars had always fascinated me, and now, of course, I also intended to be the front man of the band, the focal point on stage. No longer would I be the awkward kid, the outcast. I would be the star child. I painted a star around my right eye. It was hard work trying to draw a two-dimensional symbol on a three-dimensional object, my face. It looked one way from the front and another from the side. I was tired by the time I finally created one good star. I didn't want to struggle through painting another one on the left side. Done. It was eye-opening to watch the other guys come up with concepts that suited their personalities. Ace's design was ethereal, spacey, and in the short time I had known him then, that was exactly how I would have described him. The spaceman. He often joked about coming from a planet called Jendel. He constantly threw out off-the-wall sayings like, "One by one, I kills 'em," and spoke in made-up languages and gibberish. Sometimes he would shiver and ask, "What was that? Did we just have an earthquake?" And we'd say, "That was you. You just had a tremor." Peter's makeup was elementary. The symbolism was direct, not abstract. He felt that over the course of his life, he'd gotten lucky during a few close calls and thus had 9 lives. You know, like a cat. The Catman suited him. Peter was not what you'd call an intellectual. Gene's makeup was arguably the strongest of all. It was symmetrical and demonic. It was lascivious. It had the drama of kabuki. It was a striking image, and then when he stuck out his tongue, it just made sense, the demon. And as we would soon realize, his look and mine, me smiling, him scowling, created a great juxtaposition on stage, light and shadow. The only measure of whether the images worked was the extent to which each guy felt comfortable in his. The images all enhanced or reinforced characteristics in each of us, and in that way, they weren't just costumes. They were outward shows of things inside of us. It made sense, and we all in some way enabled each other to find those personas. We never sat down and articulated the why behind the makeup. We had no real understanding of why. We just wanted to go further than others had, to become a band the likes of which we ourselves had never seen. The makeup allowed us to embody all the qualities of the English bands I idolized. It presented a cohesive look, a united feel, and at the same time offered the possibility of distinct personalities. From this point on, we began to create a world that we ultimately inhabited and ruled, but at the start, we certainly weren't at the center of anything. We weren't part of the clique of New York bands. We weren't junkies. We didn't hang out at the Chelsea Hotel trying to relive somebody else's past. Some of us could carry on at least semi-intelligent conversations, and that wasn't cool. We were the outcasts of the outcasts. The New York Dolls and other cool bands hung out in clubs surrounded by beautiful girls. We had no time for clubs or girls. We were still too busy trying to become the band we wanted to be. The proof would be in the pudding, and we would eat it like kings. We booked 2 more shows, this time out in Amityville, Long Island, at a bar called The Daisy. It was basically a storefront and couldn't have held even 100 people. They sold watered-down drinks for 35 cents. I rented a vehicle at Public Service Rentals again, this time a decommissioned milk truck. We loaded in our gear, and by we, I mean Gene, Peter, and me, as Ace, as usual, refused to help and drove about 20 miles outside of the city. The staff bristled from the word go. I think we looked too weird and effeminate out there in the suburbs. The guy scheduled to be the bouncer that night said he was going to kick my ass. We ended up locking ourselves in the manager's office, hiding and doing our makeup. Periodically, someone pounded on the door and screamed, "I'm going to fucking kill you!" The upside of having to wait in the office was that we could answer the house phone. Several people called and asked, "Who's playing there tonight?" "This great band called Kiss. You've got to see them." When we finally emerged and took the stage, there were about 35 people in the house. Ace looked at his makeup and the reflective surface of Peter's bass drum and started cracking up. Still, we didn't encounter the antagonism from the crowd that we might have expected, given the bouncer's reaction to us even in our street clothes. A few people chuckled, but more than anything, people were just curious. And pretty much as soon as we hit the stage, they realized 2 things. First, we were serious. Second, this was great. We might have lacked technical ability, but we played with an undeniable focus and ferocity. My makeup was a mask that provided distance between me and the crowd. It gave me the shield I needed. Whatever fears I had of being ridiculed, whether for my normal appearance or for wearing makeup, disappeared. The makeup was armor. It protected me. It was also freeing. Some people were born with it all. I certainly hadn't been, but now I had it. And I was on a mission. Out came the persona I had in mind. Out came Jimmy Swaggart and Billy Graham. Out came the rock and roll evangelist. I sang the praises of mighty rock and roll and all the things I aspired to when I saw the bands I loved. This is my calling. I knew I still had a lot of work to do. Fronting a band is a craft, but I managed to engage the crowd. I was able to communicate with the audience and elicit a response. I preached rock and roll. Are you high? Everybody having a good time. More people showed up the next night and we killed it again. After the second night, we got paid. Once the truck rental and our other expenses were taken care of, we each walked away with $13. It was the first time I'd ever ended up on the plus side after a show. I had actually earned money playing rock and roll. What a feeling, and everyone seemed to share that feeling. With these shows under our belts, we felt confident in our songs. Sure, we still had tinkering to do on our look and stagecraft, but musically, we had gelled extremely quickly and our set already sounded the way we wanted it to. The next step, we figured, was to make a demo to shop to labels. Ron Johnson from Electric Lady had stayed in touch with me and Gene. We had even provided some background vocals for projects he had recorded there. Since we hadn't been paid for those sessions, we approached him with a deal. Instead of paying us, we suggested, get Eddie Kramer to do a demo with us at Electric Lady. Eddie Kramer was a legendary audio engineer and producer who had worked with the Kinks, the Small Faces, Jimi Hendrix, and Led Zeppelin. We'd seen him at the studio and he was a striking character. He sometimes walked around Electric Lady in a cape carrying a cane. He elicited both fear and awe. Ron set it up. Well, sort of. Eddie oversaw the sessions, but his assistant, Dave Whitman, did the actual recording. We cut demos of Black Diamond, Strutter, Deuce, and Watchin' You. The other track we cut, Cold Gin, was a song Ace brought to the table and Gene and I tweaked. Gene and I knew we would be depended on to bring in the songs for Kiss because Peter and Ace never showed much ambition in that department. I didn't begrudge them their limitations, but when Ace showed up with the framework of a song, I was thrilled. After all, we wanted to be like the Beatles, 4 identifiable characters. People liked the Beatles, but they also had their favorite Beatle. George Harrison had a song or two on Beatles albums, and even Ringo got to sing a novelty song now and then. It made the band, any band, more interesting. Toward that end, we had Peter sing my song Black Diamond. We wanted Ace to sing Cold Gin, too, but he refused. We figured the more fully realized the individual members of the band were, the stronger the group would be. Adding more ingredients would only make the soup better. I wanted Kiss to be a club where every member was represented. I wanted it to be multidimensional with 4 formidable personalities. The fact that one of the other guys in our band actually contributed to that illusion by bringing in a song idea was a bonus. Now with a demo in hand, we knew we couldn't be stopped. If you stood in front of us, we were going to crush you. Chapter 17. I think in some ways all bands are dysfunctional. Often part of the reason people get involved in rock and roll in the first place is because they themselves are dysfunctional. If you get lucky, you find camaraderie and some sort of chemistry. The fact that you each feel different brings you together. And certainly it's nice to be part of a club of misfits. Life is easier with a support system. From the very beginning, I felt part of something with Kiss. We were all oddballs, quirky, idiosyncratic, neurotic, but we had each other now. I can't speak for anybody else because I don't know what made them tick or what the appeal was for them at the onset, but for me, Kiss gave me a feeling of finally belonging, an us against the world kind of mentality, and I was part of that sense of us. It was empowering. In Kiss, I had a gang. I wasn't as lonely as I'd always been. But despite our shared sense of purpose, I think the 4 of us all saw the others as odd. We were all odd. And not necessarily in a way that made us gel. In Kiss, we had a collective reason for being, but outside of that, we didn't have a lot in common. So we didn't socialize together outside of the band. Ace and Peter had a lot of friends, and Peter was already married. Gene had a girlfriend. I was still pretty isolated outside of the band. Even within the band, I never let my guard down. I remained remote around my bandmates. I maintained a wall that made it difficult to get to know me at all and impossible to get to know me well. When the other guys joked around with each other, I chimed in. When they made fun of me, however, I didn't take it well. I never betrayed why I was sensitive. I sure as hell wasn't going to expose myself to potential ridicule by telling them about how shattering my experiences as a child had been as a result of my ear and deafness. I wasn't going to bring up painful things with people who might use those things against me. You can dish it out, but you can't take it, the guys would say, and it was true. It was an instinctive reaction on my part. They didn't understand how I had spent my childhood being scrutinized and ridiculed. How could they? I didn't tell them. Still, it took a lot of effort to cover something like that all the time, and it certainly affected my behavior. But I wasn't comfortable enough with myself to handle it any other way. Peter, it quickly became apparent, was also a very troubled person. He seemed to get off on causing problems within the band. One night after rehearsal, we all went down to the Chinese restaurant where Gene and I used to eat back when Wicked Lester practiced in Chinatown. Peter started making fun of the waiter in a really derogatory way. We found his behavior embarrassing and told him that if he didn't stop, we would leave the restaurant. Peter said, "If you leave the restaurant, I'm quitting the band." He kept it up. We got up and left. And sure enough, he quit the band for a few days. This type of needless drama became part of the way he operated. Ace didn't do things to sabotage the band at that point. Though lazy, he was smart and funny. He constantly told jokes. He liked to drink, but it didn't affect our work, at least in the beginning. Only later would he start to forget the punchlines to his own jokes and have to ask us how they ended. In the early days, when we practiced or played live, he stayed focused and bore down. Once Peter was back in the fold, we booked 2 more gigs at the Daisy in April. Quite a few more people showed up than the month before. I was still learning to control an audience. I felt like a lion tamer. The only way to avoid being destroyed was to put yourself in charge. "It's really great to be back," I said, pretending we'd been out on the road. "We haven't been here because we've been so busy playing." Yeah, in our egg carton-lined rehearsal space. We continued to set up on stage the same way we had from the very start at Coventry, and even in our rehearsal space. 2 vocal microphones, with one on either side of the drum kit. I may have seen myself as the front man, but my mic was never center stage. We were a combination of elements, and so like the Beatles, we never wanted anyone in the middle. Either person could be the singer depending on the song. The odd thing was that because I stood stage left, which is the right side from the audience's perspective, my deaf side faced the rest of the band. But it never occurred to me to set up on the other side. Before and after the shows, Ace continued to say, "I don't want to carry shit." That took colossal balls. But I realized that was who he was and that together we had something special. I had to weigh things in terms of what was important. I had to prioritize. Was it more important to get some guy off his ass to carry amplifiers, carry shit or leave, than to keep moving forward with the band? No. When I carried the gear, I wasn't doing it to be kind or to help him out. I was doing the right thing for me. I wasn't being charitable to his lazy ass. I knew in the end it would benefit me. It reminded me of my initial reaction to Gene. I put up with crap from him because I stood to gain more by accepting some of his behavior than I would lose by telling him to take a hike. In May, we played our first show in New York City proper on the 8th floor of a factory building on Bleecker Street. The loft served as the rehearsal space for a new band called the Brats, whose founder, Rick Rivets, had originally been in the New York Dolls. We had seen their debut show a few months before when they opened for the Dolls. We agreed to play at their loft for free and provide our PA to the other bands, the Brats and Wayne County, a transvestite and eventually transsexual who fronted a band called Queen Elizabeth. When we loaded our gear in that afternoon, the members of the Brats were not too friendly. They wanted to look like the Yardbirds and pulled it off pretty well. They all wore shag haircuts and the best rock and roll clothing, tailored velvet jackets, satin bell-bottom pants, platform boots, all the latest things from England that I recognized from the windows of Jumpin' Jack Flash and Granny Takes a Trip. And they had rock star names. In addition to Rick Rivets, there was Keith Ambrose, Sparky Donovan, and David Leeds. We plugged in to do a sound check and ran through Deuce. The atmosphere changed. The Brats suddenly became our buddies. Once again, we had found that our music broke down indifference and even hostility. We opened the show that night and then stuck around to hear Wayne County, dressed in drag, looking like a spoof of Phyllis Diller and backed by twin brothers no bigger than Oompa Loompas. Wayne's anthem was, "It takes a man like me to be a woman like me," and the high point of the show came when she ate dog food out of a toilet. Not the prettiest sight. All the cool people came to that party, though I don't think they could make heads or tails of us. I talked to Sylvain of the Dolls there. They had just signed a 2-record deal with Mercury and were in the process of recording. "Hey," I cajoled him, "why don't we do a show together?" "You guys would kill us," he said. By the time we went to pack up after the Brat set, my guitar, the walnut-colored one that Charlie the Beau had made for me, had been stolen. I had to start using a black Les Paul reissue while LeBeau made me a new guitar, an asymmetrical Flying V based on one Albert King used to play. I came to be closely associated with that Flying V until many years down the road I began to design my own line of signature guitars. We played the same Bleecker Street loft a month later, followed by another batch of shows at the Daisy. By that point, people literally broke the windows trying to get into the Daisy. It was total bedlam. But we began to encounter a catch-22 when we tried to capitalize on what to us seemed like increasing buzz. Every time we called a booking agent to help us get more gigs, we got the same response. We couldn't get a booking agent unless we had a record label. But whenever we sent demos to labels to try to get a label deal, they wanted to know who our booking agent was. So we figured we'd just have to continue booking our own shows and hope for the best. But outside of the Daisy, we seemed to run up against a wall on that front, too. "Who's your manager?" club owners asked when we rang them. "We don't have a manager." "Well, we need to talk to a manager." "Unless we play at your club, we can't get a manager." "Sorry." Something had to give. Then we had an idea. What about the Hotel Diplomat where the Dolls had played? It wasn't a club, so we wouldn't need to persuade a booker or manager to hire us. We just needed to rent the place out. It could be our way to bypass the roadblocks we kept running up against. Everything would be in our own hands. I went to the hotel to inquire about renting the ballroom. It was $500. That was a lot of money, but we decided to bite the bullet. We knew we couldn't fill the place on our own, so we asked the Brats to headline the show. We agreed to pay them a few $100. We even wrote out a contract like concert promoters. We were up to our necks now. In order to draw a crowd and have any chance of recouping our outlay, we realized we had to advertise. We needed handbills we could post around town, and we needed to take out an ad in some of the local papers like the Village Voice. This would all take money too, but Gina and I were still working, and I had gotten Ace a job driving for the same taxi company I drove for. We also wanted a band logo to make the ads and posters look good. Ace had jotted down a logo for the flyer for our Bleecker Street loft shows. He was a pretty decent artist. I took his sketch and used it as the basis for a series of Kiss logos I designed, ultimately arriving at the one that has adorned all things Kiss for the past 40 years. I vividly remember sitting on my parents' sofa while they were out of town and drawing up the final version on thick white stock using a straight edge and a drafting pen. The SS in the logo actually consists of one S that is thicker than the other with different proportions, and they aren't exactly parallel because I just eyeballed it. Ace's concept was closer to the Nazi SS. I certainly suspected that was his inspiration, and the fact that a few years later he bought Nazi memorabilia on our first European tour confirmed this in my mind. As a Jew, I was sensitive about the SS, and Gene's family had survived the Holocaust. My father never liked our logo because he thought my version was still too close to the Nazi lightning bolts, but for me, it didn't hit home until years later when I learned our logo was banned in Germany because Nazi imagery was illegal there. When I drafted the logo, I certainly never intended to court controversy at the expense of victims of history. I didn't want that on my conscience. Once we'd taken care of the ads, we put posters up all over the city. We did it ourselves, at night. We'd take 2 posters, wrap them around something like a signpost, and staple both sides together. I also made logo t-shirts, cutting stencils of the logo from cardboard, laying them on black t-shirts, and then painting rubber cement on the fabric and pouring glitter onto it. Take off the stencil, and there was a sparkling metallic Kiss logo on black. Peter's sister made some too, and we passed them out to friends of the band for the show. We also made up rough and ready media kits and sent them out to people whose names we found in magazines and the credits of record sleeves, managers and producers and booking agents. You could find all sorts of information if you scoured publications like Billboard. Each kit had a folder with a bio featuring the logo, an 8x10 photo, and complimentary passes to the Diplomat. Nobody was hustling like that back then. The show passes listed the set time for our show, not the Brat show, even though they were more the draw. We hoped that the industry types would show up, see a packed ballroom, and assume we had brought the crowd. We had some additional ideas about our stage show, too. In June, I saw Alice Cooper's Billion Dollar Babies tour, and the theatricality made a huge impression on me. He really opened my eyes to the possibilities of a rock and roll show. Although it was more staged than anything I wanted to do, it seemed quite choreographed and the whole thing had a scripted feel to it. I liked the atmosphere and environment he created. I wanted Kiss to do things as visually arresting as that, but I wanted the band to be the show by itself as opposed to something that was providing a soundtrack for a separate drama. I wanted Kiss to command the same kind of attention without the use of dancers or giant toothbrushes. The question was how. It would be a while before we fleshed out anything along those lines, but one thing we did immediately was buy a truckload of empty speaker cabinets. They cost next to nothing and looked like Marshall amps. We figured we could stack the empty speaker cabinets on stage to give our setup the right image. We just had to warn the spotlight operator not to hit them with the light because then people would be able to see that they were empty. Early on the day of the show, July 13th, 1973, I rented a van and we loaded in and inconspicuously set up all our gear before anyone else arrived. This was a ruse to make people think we had a road crew. When people eventually showed up, we wanted them to see everything ready for us to walk on the stage, as if somebody had taken care of it all before we even arrived at the venue. Nobody would realize we had humped it all ourselves. In actuality, we had just one guy, a friend of Ace's named Eddie Solon, who handled the sound on our PA. After we set everything up at the hotel, we went back to our loft on 23rd Street and got ready for the show, doing our makeup and putting on our outfits. Peter was up to his usual shenanigans, threatening to quit the band just as we thought we were on the verge of taking a step forward. In order to make him feel better, Gina and I arranged a special treat. When we all went downstairs to go to the hotel, a limo was waiting at the curb. It made all of us, not just Peter, feel special to show up in that car. I can't imagine a limo had ever pulled up in front of that place. The ballroom was nearly full. We realized immediately that we must have covered our expenses. There were probably 400 people there, and at $3 a ticket, we would be in the black. We stomped through the audience in full regalia and took the stage. At least one A&R exec showed up for the show as we had hoped. His name was Rich Chatoyan, and he worked for Windfall Records, which was the home of the band Mountain, who'd had a massive hit with Mississippi Queen a few years before. "Listen," he said, "you guys are great, but honestly, I don't know what to do with you." It didn't seem like a big mystery to me. If you thought we were good live, just put out a record. I didn't think people needed to think about packaging us or marketing us. Just put it out. Of course, it wasn't the last time somebody was taken aback by our makeup. But by this time, we had confidence, conviction even, in what we were doing. And since we hadn't lost money on the show, we also knew we could do this again and get more people to check us out. Maybe somebody would figure us out. "This is who we are," we told the guy. "We are KISS." Chapter 18. We decided to stage another rock and roll ball at the Hotel Diplomat on Friday, August 10th, 1973. This time we took a leap of faith and headlined it ourselves. We felt we'd done our apprenticeship and were ready to make a bombastic entrance onto the next level. Yet in many ways, KISS was still an unknown commodity. One day I ran into a girl I'd known at school and showed her the poster for our upcoming Diplomat show. "We'll have 300 or 400 people there," I told her. "What? No way." She wasn't joking. She really didn't believe me. In the grand scheme of things, KISS still didn't really exist. We knew we had a small following, but filling the Daisy or even the Diplomat, what did it mean? Then again, did the Dolls have a much bigger following? They had a record deal, but they were still basically a local act. Did anyone know the Dolls in Portland, Oregon? No. And for that matter, did the people I grew up with in Queens know the Dolls? Doubtful. Just to be safe, we still pulled in a couple of the cool bands to open, Street Punk and Luger, who, like the Brats, had shared bills with the Dolls. Again, we took out ads in the paper, put up posters all over town, and sent out media kits to anyone in the industry we could identify and track down. And again, mercifully, the same result, a full house. But again, we failed to land a deal for a booker, a manager, or a record label. There was, however, one person waiting to talk to us after the show. His name was Bill O'Coin. He mentioned that he had worked on something called Flipside, which didn't ring a bell for me. I assumed it was a teen magazine like Tiger Beat or 16. Bill didn't come from a management background, obviously, but here he was talking about how he wanted to manage us. He seemed to get us. Not only that, he seemed really into us. He'd heard us, he'd seen us, and he seemed to believe in us. We agreed to meet him. A few days later, Gene and I went to his office at 75 East 55th Street, just off Madison Avenue. He shared space with an ad agency called Howard Marks Advertising. It seemed like a friendly place all around. "Listen," he said right off the bat, "unless you want to be the biggest band in the world, I'm not interested in managing you." That was quite a statement from a guy who had never managed a band. But as Bill talked, he struck me as the missing piece of the puzzle. I had the same feeling I'd had when Ace plugged in. Bill was a kindred spirit. It turned out that Flipside was a TV show that took viewers into the studio with bands as they recorded. Bill had also been the director of photography for a Barbra Streisand TV special. Somehow it seemed logical that an unconventional band would hook up with a manager who wasn't a manager. What Bill did have was contacts that could take us to the next level. We weren't going to find that in a rock club, even if we landed a booking agent. Maybe it wasn't surprising, given his background in TV, that Bill had a lot of ideas about theatricality, too. One thing he suggested was that we never be seen without our makeup. I would never have thought of that. We would exist only as Kiss. He thought beyond what any of us was thinking at that point. He saw a much bigger picture. He was definitely tuned into what we were doing and what we could yet do. And his belief in Kiss was striking. Maybe he wasn't jaded because he'd never been a manager. Bill made one other claim. If you decide to sign with me and I can't get you a record contract within 2 weeks, I'll void the contract. You'll be free. 2 weeks? Wow. At that point, the only sniff we'd had from a label was the guy from Windfall. We said we'd think it over. Outside his office, Gene and I agreed that we liked Bill and his ideas, but I asked Gene, "Do you care if our manager's gay?" "Why?" Bill was fastidious and very well manicured. I read him as gay, but since Bill wasn't overtly effeminate, it had gone right over Gene's head, apparently. "Because this guy's gay." "How can you tell?" Gene asked. Well, he was impeccable, too studied for a heterosexual. Everything was right, the tie, the jacket, the haircut, even his shoes. You and I would never bother with all that. Gene shrugged his shoulders. Good. It wasn't an issue for either of us. Next, we called Peter. We met the guy who should be our manager, we told him. We explained that Bill really understood Kiss. He really got it. We talked about all the things Bill had said he could do for us. Peter was skeptical, as he should have been. When I told him that Bill didn't want to work with us unless we wanted to be the biggest band in the world, Peter said, "Bullshit. People say shit like that all the time." "No, this guy is the real deal," I said. "Get this. If he doesn't get us a record deal within 2 weeks, we can leave." That did the trick. After chatting with Ace, who also got on board, we called Bill and said we wanted him to manage us. "Just one last thing," he said. "You guys don't have any contracts with anyone else, right?" We told him that we had signed something with Ron Johnson, but that it was no big deal. Bill needed to see the agreement anyway. We took a copy to him. We were crushed when he told us, "I'm really sorry, guys, but I can't do anything. You can't piss without Ron Johnson's permission. You're signed lock, stock, and barrel. I can't manage you. There's nothing to manage." A few days after that conversation with Bill, Ron called me out of the blue. "There's a minor complication with your contract with me," he said. "It's run out, so we have to get together and re-sign it." Apparently, the production deal Gene and I had signed with Ron while still in Wicked Lester had expired unnoticed. That was fate. I called the other guys, and then we called Bill to tell him that we were free. Bill O'Coin became our manager, and soon we came to consider him the 5th member of Kiss. Chapter 19. We can argue about whether beggars can be choosers, but when Bill told us Neil Bogart wanted to sign Kiss to a record deal, I thought it was our shot. Neil had turned Buddha Records into the #1 singles label in the country by cranking out what some in the rock community might have regarded as prefab crap. He basically invented bubblegum music with acts like the Ohio Express, 1910 Fruit Gum Company, and the Lemon Pipers. Yummy, 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 chewy, chewy, chewy. Neil had recently left Buddha to start his own venture, which was originally going to be called Emerald City Records, but eventually became known as Casablanca. He agreed to sign us after he heard our demo, and a couple of producers he knew told him how good they thought the demos were, too. Neil told Bill, "I'm leaving Buddha and want your guys to be my first act." But Neil had never seen us live at that point. When he finally saw the makeup, he asked us to take it off. That was a deal breaker. Soon, though, Neil realized it was our calling card, the visual embodiment of our mentality. He acquiesced and made us the very first act on his new label. Neil and Bill set up a private concert for the press in early September 1973, and for dramatic effect, we signed the contract and makeup at that event. Now, at first blush, I would certainly rather have signed to a label like Atlantic. Neil had made his career flogging singles, and though he said he wanted to launch Casablanca with a credible rock band, which almost by definition meant marketing albums, not singles, I had my doubts. After all, singles sold by getting airplay on Top 40 radio on the AM dial. Rock was played on progressive FM radio stations. But nothing in Kiss World ever went according to plan. In retrospect, that's part of the beauty of it. Throughout the band's career, we've ignored the rules either deliberately or by circumstance. In this case, we didn't seem to have any choice. It wasn't as if other labels were beating down our door. Once fully on board, Neil got excited. He began to chip in with ideas on how to make our show even bigger. It was Neil who suggested the elevating drum riser. His original concept was basically a forklift, 2 prongs beneath the drum riser to lift it. Neil, it was clear, got it. Bill, however, proved the critical visionary, able to take what was still a rough diamond and polish it. Once we had secured our deal with Casablanca, Bill quickly unveiled some of his ideas for the band. The first thing he did was introduce us to his boyfriend, Sean Delaney, who unified our look by dyeing all our hair blue-black. We all had dark hair already, but he wanted us to match. We went to an apartment on 11th Street and 6th Avenue and dunked our heads in a bathtub to give us what Sean wanted to be the jet-black hair of Elvis or Roy Orbison. Bill also rented a new rehearsal space for us, a cramped, rat-infested basement in the Village. And in there, he set up a video camera. Again, this was something that never would have occurred to me. We could see ourselves. Great idea. Even bands like Kiss that prided themselves on being visually arresting rarely had a chance to see what they really looked like. Together with Sean, who was himself a performer, singer, and songwriter, Bill wanted to analyze the way we moved. This was the TV guy thinking, obviously. When I performed, I thought of myself as moving all around, swinging my arms and embodying the rock and roll guitar hero thing. But when we went to the videotape, I could see how small everything was. You could barely make out my gestures. I had to modify my moves if I really wanted to grab the audience. Sean served as coach and cheerleader, helping me to develop dynamic, effective moves. Like everyone else in our haphazardly assembled team, Sean became devoted to fleshing out the Kiss concept and helping us be as good as we could possibly be. Once during rehearsal, he noticed us kind of swaying in unison for a second. He found the spot on the tape and played it back for us. "See this moment when you move together," he said? "That should be part of the show. That should be something you do, a signature move." I think initially we all thought it was kind of corny. We were going to be choreographed? But we decided to give Sean's idea a go, and the 3 of us, Gene, Ace, and me, stood close together at the front of the stage, moving our guitars and swaying. Looking at the videos, we realized that it worked. Sean was right. And sure enough, when we first did it in front of an audience, people went crazy. Sean's move killed. We didn't know we needed a Sean until we had Sean. He really upped the theatricality of our act, and later he co-wrote songs with almost all of us. Another day, Bill had us into his office. He introduced us to a guy named the Amazing Amazo, or something corny like that. "A magician," he said. The guy breathed a ball of fire and scorched the ceiling of Bill's office. "Okay," said Bill. "Who wants to do this on stage?" "Not me." Gene agreed to give it a try, and the rest is history. All of this reinforced my initial thoughts about Bill. His ideas were miles away from those of other people, including the members of the band, or any other band for that matter. Bill understood as much as we did that we didn't have to play by anyone else's rules. He approached things without preconceptions, and he was energetically delivering on everything he had said at our first meeting. Near the end of September, almost 9 months to the day since our first ever gig together at Coventry, and only a few weeks beyond Bill's self-imposed 2-week deadline, we went into Bell Sound to record our debut album. Our debut album! We requested Eddie Kramer as the producer since we were pretty pleased with the demo he had supervised. But Neil had something against him. Eddie had worked on an album by the band Stories for Buddha Records that hadn't spawned any hits and might also have cost more than Neil expected. So Neil paired us with Richie Wise and Kenny Kerner, who had actually gone into the studio with Stories after Eddie and cut their big hit, Brother Louie. Opening that door on 54th Street, walking up the stairs and entering Bell Sound the first day was terrific and terrifying. We set up all our gear and the technicians placed all the microphones. I was afraid that if anything moved, the results would be cataclysmic. I ran around telling the guys, "Don't touch anything, it's exactly where it needs to be." We were totally green, But this could not have been more different from Wicked Lester going into the studio on spec time. This time we had producers who led us and told us what to do. We recorded quickly, all in the same room with virtually no overdubs. We had the songs down, and they changed very little from the demos we had cut back in March. We didn't understand anything. We just waited to be told what was next. At first, I was self-conscious in the studio. I knew the song so well, but when the tape was rolling, I started watching my fingers on the guitar and fouled up. Something that came so naturally became stilted. I saw the microphone as an intimidating obstacle in front of my face instead of seeing it as an ear, just a way to speak to the public, like on stage. I had to stop thinking about the surroundings. I had to recognize that all the studio gadgetry was a vehicle to get to the public, not an obstacle. It took some time, but I settled down. I still had a lot to learn, how to sing into the mic, when to sing away from it. But part of what makes the first album so vibrant and alive is the fact that the musicians are typically just pups. That was certainly true for us. I was only 21 years old. When it came to listening back to our music on studio equipment, the fact that I was deaf on one side had no effect to the mic. It was the way I had always heard music, and my inability to hear stereo had no bearing on what I did or thought because it was the way I had always heard things. The one thing I noticed was that when we listened to the mixes, I found myself sitting a few feet to the right of center. I just scooted over to compensate without even thinking about it. That didn't mean I was hearing stereo, but it created a balance. Whenever I was between two speakers, I would move to where the sound was optimal for me. If I looked up, I was always toward the right side. At lunchtime, sandwiches magically appeared. It was incredible. All this and free food, too? We had no idea at that time that all those sorts of perks were tacked onto the recording bill, which went onto the tab we owed the record company. All I could think was, we're in a studio, recording songs we wrote, living the dream and being fed. How much better can it get? We talked Peter through the songs as we recorded them. I had a microphone into which I had to say things like, okay, here comes the dat, or now the rat-a-tat-tat. It was the only thing that worked. I didn't think the drums had the same power I heard on records by a lot of British bands I listened to at the time, but that was mostly because of the way our album was engineered. Old school engineers didn't believe in pushing the meters into the red. They thought it was wrong. You didn't want distortion. You didn't want to overdrive things. Kenny and Ritchie's engineer definitely fell into that school, and it affected the recordings. I wished we had somebody who was aware of what was being done in the contemporary world of the genre we worked in. But we didn't, so our record came out a bit flat. The guitar sounded plinky and piano-like instead of big. Gene's bass runs, he wasn't a bass player who stuck to pedaling on the root note, got lost. The vocals had more of an ambient quality. The overall sound lacked breadth. Pushing the limits on the recording console gave a lot of our contemporaries a pulsating urgency that our record lacked. It was another case of things not going to plan. Sure, it was a bit rinky-dink sounding, but based on the way the album has since been received, I suppose it might have been a blessing in disguise that the recordings didn't sound as bombastic as I thought we sounded live. And anyway, just making a record far outweighed any critiques I might have had about the sonic qualities of the recordings. Each night we left the studio with a great sense of accomplishment. We said goodnight, see you tomorrow, then we each went to our parents' places, except Peter, who was married and living with his wife. Before long, we had finished all 9 songs. We had our debut album in the can. The art department at Casablanca asked whether they should redraft the logo for the album cover to make each S the same width and ensure they were perfectly parallel. It got us this far, I said. Don't touch it. Next, we needed a band photo for the album cover. In those days, people still misunderstood us, even people hired to work with us. The photographer who shot our first album cover, Joel Brodsky, had done the Strange Days cover for The Doors. When we showed up at his studio, he was very friendly and seemed genuinely excited. "Look what I've got for you," he said. He brought out a carton filled with all sorts of straw hats and red rubber noses. "What the hell?" "You know, for your pictures," Joel said. "No, I don't think you understand," we told him. "We're serious. We're not clowns. This is what we do." He was stunned. "You mean you guys aren't meant to be funny?" No, this is us. He could keep the straw hats and red noses. A lot of people didn't understand that this wasn't fun and games to us. It wasn't frivolous. It was a religion. It was a crusade. Joel told us there was a makeup person on hand for the shoot. We all did our own makeup anyway, except Peter. He had the makeup person do it, who decided to make his face look like some sort of tribal lion mask. We had never seen that makeup before, and we were glad not to see it again. So maybe our record cover didn't look the way I had expected. And maybe the record didn't sound the way I had expected. But by God, we had an album. That trumped everything else. I was so excited. For all the minuses I may have felt about the sound or the cover, we now had a finished album, which was the prerequisite for all the other things we wanted to do. We were in the game now. With everything done, Bill told us we were going to go out and start playing. I had no concept of the country we lived in, let alone the world. The idea that we were going to travel to other cities, I didn't have the slightest idea what these places were like. I just assumed every new city would be like New York. We had our revamped show nearly ready to go. The forklift contraption would lift Peter's drum kit up about 7 feet. We had Gene fire-breathing and the three of us swaying in unison. Just one last piece of the puzzle remained as far as our show was concerned: pyro. Pyro had not yet become a science. We just auditioned a few maniacs who liked to blow shit up. We needed somebody who could make big booms. Bill eventually found our guy, God knows where. I don't really know if there were any credentials at all for early pyrotechnicians. All they needed was a fascination with fire and explosives. We probably saved lives and property by hiring these guys and keeping some arsonists and pyromaniacs off the street.